Welcome to Just Stories. We hope you enjoy the story. Grinding to a Halt, The War of Attrition, by Just Stories. Chapter 1, From Border Skirmishes to All-Out War. The War of Attrition between Israel and Egypt, which took place from 1969 to 1970, was a complex and multifaceted conflict that began as a series of border skirmishes and escalated into a full-blown military confrontation. In this chapter, we will explore the early stages of the war, from the initial clashes along the border to the buildup of heavy artillery and missile systems in the Sinai Peninsula. In the years leading up to the War of Attrition, tension between Israel and Egypt was high. The two countries had fought a major conflict in 1967, known as the Six-Day War, which had resulted in a decisive Israeli victory. However, the outcome of the war had left Egypt feeling humiliated and determined to regain its military standing in the region. The first signs of trouble came in early 1969, when Israel and Egypt began exchanging artillery fire across their border. These skirmishes were small in scale and did not immediately lead to a wider conflict. However, they were a harbinger of things to come. In July of that year, Egypt made a bold move by moving heavy artillery and missile systems into the Sinai Peninsula, which had been demilitarized under the terms of the 1967 ceasefire agreement. Israel responded by launching a series of airstrikes on Egyptian positions, destroying much of the new hardware. The situation escalated rapidly from there. In August, Egypt launched a massive artillery bombardment of Israeli positions along the Suez Canal, which lasted for several days. Israel responded with airstrikes and a ground offensive aimed at pushing Egyptian forces back from the canal. The fighting was intense and brutal, with both sides taking heavy casualties. Despite the ferocity of the conflict, however, neither side was able to achieve a decisive victory. Instead, the two sides settled into a pattern of constant shelling and sporadic raids. The War of Attrition was a difficult and frustrating conflict for both sides. The constant shelling made life unbearable for civilians living near the front lines, and troops on both sides were subjected to frequent attacks and long periods of isolation. Maintaining supply lines was a constant challenge, and troops often had to go without food, water, and medical supplies for extended periods of time. As the conflict dragged on, both sides began to realize that a stalemate was inevitable. In August 1970, they agreed to a ceasefire, which brought an end to the War of Attrition. Although the conflict did not result in a clear victory for either side, it had far-reaching implications for the Middle East and set the stage for future conflicts in the region. In conclusion, the War of Attrition began as a series of border skirmishes, but quickly escalated into a full-blown military confrontation. The conflict was marked by intense fighting, constant shelling, and long periods of isolation for troops on both sides. Despite the challenges faced by both sides, however, the conflict did not result in a decisive victory for either party. Chapter 2, The Battle for the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal was a key strategic asset during the War of Attrition, as it provided a vital shipping route between Europe and Asia. As a result, control of the canal was a top priority for both Israel and Egypt, and the battles that took place along its banks were some of the most intense of the conflict. In this chapter, we will explore the key battles that shaped the battle for the Suez Canal. The first major engagement of the War of Attrition along the Suez Canal took place in August 1969. After Egypt had moved heavy artillery and missile systems into the Sinai Peninsula, Israel launched a ground offensive aimed at pushing back Egyptian forces and securing control of the canal. The initial Israeli assault was successful, with troops managing to capture several key positions along the canal. However, Egypt responded with a massive artillery bombardment, forcing the Israelis to retreat. Over the next several months, both sides engaged in a series of raids and counter-raids along the canal, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. The fighting was intense and often took place in close quarters, with troops on both sides using tunnels and trenches to move around and launch surprise attacks. In March 1970, Egypt launched a major offensive aimed at regaining control of the canal. The offensive was a surprise attack, launched under cover of darkness, and caught the Israelis off guard. Egyptian troops managed to capture several key positions, including a strategic bridge over the canal. The Israelis responded with a massive counteroffensive involving both ground troops and airstrikes. The fighting was brutal, with both sides taking heavy casualties. However, after several days of intense fighting, the Israelis managed to retake the lost positions and push Egyptian forces back from the canal. The battle for the Suez Canal was a grueling and brutal conflict, which took a heavy toll on both sides. The canal remained a contested area throughout the War of Attrition, and neither side was able to secure control of it for any significant length of time. Despite the difficulties of the conflict, the battle for the Suez Canal had far-reaching implications for the region. The constant fighting along the canal helped to shape the military tactics and strategies of both Israel and Egypt, and set the stage for future conflicts between the two countries. In conclusion, the battle for the Suez Canal was one of the defining conflicts of the War of Attrition. The fighting was intense and brutal, and took a heavy toll on both sides. Although neither side was able to secure control of the canal for any significant length of time, the conflict had far-reaching implications for the region and helped to shape the military tactics and strategies of both Israel and Egypt. Chapter 3: The Role of the Superpowers. The War of Attrition between Israel and Egypt was not just a conflict between two countries, but also a proxy war between the United States and the Soviet Union. In this chapter, we will explore the role of these superpowers in the conflict, and how their involvement impacted the course of the war. The United States had long been a key ally of Israel, and during the War of Attrition, it provided significant military and economic support to the country. This support included the provision of advanced weapons systems, such as the F-4 Phantom fighter jet, which played a key role in Israeli airstrikes on Egyptian positions. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, was a key ally of Egypt and provided the country with military and economic support throughout the conflict. This support included the provision of weapons and ammunition, as well as technical assistance in the form of military advisors. The involvement of the superpowers had a significant impact on the course of the War of Attrition. The military support provided by the United States helped to bolster Israel's military capabilities, allowing it to launch successful airstrikes and ground offensives against Egyptian positions. However, it also led to an escalation of the conflict, as Egypt sought to counterbalance the United States' support for Israel by increasing its own military capabilities. The Soviet Union's support for Egypt, meanwhile, helped to offset the United States' military advantage and allowed Egypt to continue to resist Israeli attacks. However, it also led to an escalation of the conflict, as Israel sought to counterbalance the Soviet Union's support for Egypt by increasing its own military capabilities. The involvement of the superpowers also had broader implications for the Middle East. The United States and the Soviet Union were competing for influence in the region, and the War of Attrition provided an opportunity for each side to demonstrate its military prowess and gain the upper hand. The conflict also contributed to the growing polarization of the region, with Israel and its allies on one side, and Egypt and its Soviet backers on the other. In conclusion, the involvement of the United States and the Soviet Union in the War of Attrition had a significant impact on the course of the conflict. Their military and economic support helped to bolster their respective allies' capabilities, but also led to an escalation of the conflict and broader implications for the Middle East. The War of Attrition was not just a conflict between Israel and Egypt, but also a proxy war between the world's two superpowers, and its impact is still felt in the region today. Chapter 4: Stalemate and Frustration. The War of Attrition was a long and grueling conflict that lasted for over a year. As the fighting dragged on, both sides found themselves increasingly mired in a stalemate, with neither able to gain a decisive advantage. In this chapter, we will explore the challenges faced by both sides, and the toll that the conflict took on troops and civilians alike. One of the biggest challenges faced by both Israel and Egypt during the War of Attrition was maintaining supply lines. The constant shelling and sporadic raids made it difficult to transport food, water, and medical supplies to troops on the front lines. This led to frequent shortages and often forced troops to go without basic necessities for extended periods of time. The constant shelling also made life unbearable for civilians living near the front lines. Homes and businesses were destroyed, and many people were forced to flee their homes in search of safety. Schools and hospitals were forced to close, leaving many without access to essential services. The toll on troops was also significant. Constant exposure to shelling and sniper fire led to high levels of stress and trauma, and many soldiers developed physical and mental health problems as a result. The isolation and long periods of waiting between attacks also took a toll on morale, leading to widespread frustration and disillusionment. Despite the challenges faced by both sides, however, the stalemate persisted. The conflict had become a war of attrition, with both sides hoping to wear down the other through constant attacks and raids. This led to a cycle of frustration and futility, as both sides realized that a decisive victory was unlikely. As the conflict dragged on, both Israel and Egypt began to realize that a stalemate was inevitable. Neither side was able to gain a decisive advantage, and the cost of continuing the conflict was becoming increasingly high. In August 1970, the two sides agreed to a ceasefire, which brought an end to the War of Attrition. In conclusion, the War of Attrition was a long and grueling conflict that left both sides frustrated and exhausted. The constant shelling and sporadic raids made life unbearable for civilians, while troops faced significant challenges in maintaining supply lines and dealing with the toll of the conflict on their physical and mental health. Despite the challenges, however, the stalemate persisted, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. The conflict became a war of attrition, with both sides hoping to wear down the other through constant attacks and raids. The War of Attrition may not have resulted in a clear victory for either side, but it left a lasting impact on the Middle East and the wider world. Chapter 5: Ceasefire and Aftermath. The War of Attrition between Israel and Egypt came to an end in August 1970, when the two sides agreed to a ceasefire. Although the conflict did not result in a clear victory for either side, it had far-reaching implications for the Middle East and the wider world. In this chapter, we will explore the ceasefire and its aftermath, and the impact of the conflict on both Israel and Egypt. The ceasefire, which was brokered by the United States and the Soviet Union, brought an end to the constant shelling and sporadic raids that had characterized the War of Attrition. It allowed civilians to return to their homes and businesses, and provided some relief to troops who had been under constant attack for over a year. However, the ceasefire did not bring an end to the underlying tensions between Israel and Egypt. Although both sides agreed to stop the fighting, they remained deeply distrustful of each other, and continued to engage in low-level conflicts and skirmishes in the years that followed. The War of Attrition had also left a lasting impact on both Israel and Egypt. Israel had been forced to confront the limitations of its military might, and had realized that a decisive victory over its Arab neighbors was unlikely. Egypt, meanwhile, had been humiliated by the outcome of the conflict, and had suffered significant losses in both troops and resources. The War of Attrition also had broader implications for the Middle East and the wider world. It had demonstrated the limits of military force in resolving regional conflicts, and had contributed to the growing polarization of the region. It had also contributed to the ongoing Arab-Israeli conflict, which has continued to shape the region to this day. In the years that followed the ceasefire, both Israel and Egypt took steps to address the underlying tensions that had led to the conflict. In 1973, Egypt launched a surprise attack on Israel, known as the Yom Kippur War, which resulted in a temporary shift in the balance of power in the region. This led to renewed efforts to negotiate a lasting peace agreement between Israel and its Arab neighbors. Despite the challenges, progress has been made in recent years. In 1978, Israel and Egypt signed the Camp David Accords, which paved the way for a peace treaty between the two countries. Since then, other Arab countries have followed suit, and several have established diplomatic relations with Israel. In conclusion, the ceasefire that brought an end to the War of Attrition marked the end of a grueling and difficult conflict. Although the ceasefire did not bring an end to the underlying tensions between Israel and Egypt, it provided some relief to civilians and troops who had suffered under constant attack for over a year. The War of Attrition had far-reaching implications for the Middle East and the wider world, and its impact is still felt today. However, the conflict also led to renewed efforts to negotiate a lasting peace agreement between Israel and its Arab neighbors, and progress has been made in recent years towards achieving this goal. Thank you for watching our story. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss out on our next video.